Hello, everyone. Very excited to be back with you. Last week's episode, I wasn't involved with, and you, Jason, and my beautiful wife, Lisa, did a great job holding down the fort, talking about snails. That was a really fun episode to edit. I got to edit it and also to listen to. So you guys did a good job, but what are we talking about today? Something quite different from what you talked about last week.
Well, as we've been discussing, we did African cichlids part 1, and then we were asked, hey, do African cichlids part 2, and so we did that. And then sure enough, we didn't get nearly as far as we thought we were going to, and we left out all the Lake Tanganyikan cichlids from Africa, and people asked for part 3, and so this week, we're doing part 3, African cichlids from Lake Tanganyika. My personal favorite, I know you're partial to the Lake Malawis, and that's awesome. I can totally see why. They're absolutely full of color. But I like the Lake Tanganyikan, so I'm excited to talk about them today.
Yeah, I love Lake Tanganyika. I love the fish that come from there. One of my top 10 fish in the whole hobby is frontosas. And one of my holy grail fish is from Lake Tanganyika. We'll talk about that later, but I love Lake Tanganyikan fish. I'm just more of a Malawi guy, you know. I mean, that is the way it is, but I'm certainly not against them, or, you know, if I had to pick one, I suppose I'd pick Malawi. But because I'm so much more vested in the Malawi side of things, I'm not going to claim to be some kind of an expert on Tanganyika. I'm going to leave that to you. So what I wanted to do with this, even though I'm very unprofessional and have done very little prep for this, I wanted to basically ask you, because you are much more well-versed, dare I say an expert on Lake Tanganyika. I just want to ask you questions that I believe our viewers, our listeners would want to hear. So are you up for that game plan? You feel good
I think
about
I'm
that?
up for it. I would definitely not call myself an expert, but I am somebody who's absolutely kept lots and lots and lots of Lake Tanganyikan fish, bred lots of them over the course of the years in our fish room. But I think for the most part, if people are somewhat familiar with Lake Tanganyikans or they've never heard them before, there's a lot to learn here. But you know what? Before we get started, I did want to mention one thing, and one of our channel sponsors is Fritz Aquatics. Fritz Aquatics is awesome. We love them. We use a lot of their products. And one of the things that I have found really, really helpful lately are these guys right here, these 6-in-1 test strips. I don't know if you use them in your fish room. Listen.
I do. And we sell them.
Right?
Yep.
So they even make musical noises. But these 6-in-1 test strips are outstanding. And I'm telling you, if you want to test your water parameters to make sure, especially with your cichlids, especially with your Lake Tanganyikan cichlids, that you don't have any ammonia, nitrite, your nitrate is where it's supposed to be. Now, this one doesn't do ammonia, but it does the nitrite, nitrate, does pH, water hardness. These are really, really simple to use. Fritz Aquatics, you said you've got them over there at keepfishkeeping.com. Try these out. They're not very expensive, and what is there, like 100, 200 in there? 100 strips. And pro tip, you cut them lengthwise right down the center. Now you got 200, and they're just as easy to read. So Fritz Aquatics, thank you so much for being a partner with the Tank Talk podcast. All right, commercial over. What do we got? Lake Tanganyika.
So this is a lake that, you know, when you talk about Malawi, it's real simple. You got peacocks, haps, and bunas. You know, and bunas being the smallest, peacocks there in the middle, haps are the ones that are the biggest. But I think, and I'd like to get your explanation on this, I think there's a vast difference in the fish from Tanganyika. It's a much more widespread. You got little teeny ones all the way up to the gargantuan one, which is the one that's on my holy grail list. Again, talk about that later. Talk about the differences in the fish that come from that lake, particularly sizes. And then, you know, maybe we can talk about tank sizes for those individuals and stuff like that too.
Yeah. So what's interesting about Lake Tanganyika, just in and of itself, its geography and its ecosystem, it is one of the deepest lakes in the world. And so it offers a lot of different ecosystems. It borders a number of different countries. And the lake is so deep, in fact, that as you get towards the bottom, there's really nothing down there. The temperature is drastically colder. The oxygen levels are way, way less than they are near the surface. And then you've got the entire perimeter of the lake where it's mostly sandy, but the whole lake, for the most part, is a lot of sand, a lot of rocks, and a lot of shells. And so that's the habitat that we find most of these fish in. And you're absolutely right. When it comes to the fish, you've got our little tiny shell dwellers, which most people have kept. They're max out somewhere, some of them only around an inch or so, some of them a little bit larger, maybe a few inches, all the way up to, I'm talking about common aquarium fish, all the way up to the frontosa that can be easily over a foot. And you've got so much variability there in terms of their size, but also their shape, their behavior, their their overall body composition. It's a lot different because when we talked about the Lake Malawi's, the Mbuna, they all mostly look this. Now the colors are drastically different, but for the most
Right.
part, their body shapes, their size, very, very similar. When we talked about the peacocks, you made a great point of it when we did that episode that the peacocks have a very similar size and shape. Perhaps they can look a little bit different. In Lake Malawi, we discussed, man, tons and tons of color. Lake Tanganyika, there are still some very, very striking fish, but the real power in that lake is the fact that you have such diversity in terms of size, shape, and personality.
Including one of the most alien looking fish. And I swear to you, this fish looks like it should be on a Pixar film. It just looks not real. And that is the compressiceps, the gold heads and I've, I've always just called them altos. And I tried to say the word ultralamprologus.
Altolampologus.
I tried to say that when we were talking before we started recording, and for some reason it sounded like a sneeze, but I've just always called them altos. But some of those are just the most fascinating looking fish. So yeah, very diverse in the different shapes and not as much color, but still gorgeous color.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to have, to my knowledge, I don't think there is a bright red fish from Lake Tanganyika. At least none's coming to mind.
Nothing that I can think of, no. But you've got some really intense blues and some yellows.
Yellows.
And there are some really pretty fish. And again, the nice thing, if you're watching this and you're like, cichlids, they're not for me, well, don't be so quick to judge the Lake Tanganyikans just yet, because for some of these fish, you can keep a breeding pair in a 10-gallon. This is unlike
Yep.
the cichlids from Lake Malawi. I can't think of any Lake Malawi fish I'm keeping in a 10-gallon, and probably not a 20. We talked about in those videos. Yeah, 40 breeder is pretty much your minimum. Could you have a breeding group in a 29? Even that's really stretching it. But
Hmm.
these Lake Tanganyikans, if you start out with the shell dwellers, I did an entire video on the shell dwellers that we had kept at that time. And I think just off the top of my head, I could probably name 8 to 10 different types of shell dwelling Lake Tanganyikan cichlids that we've kept. And in just about every single case, if you've got a 20-gallon, you've got a tank that's large enough for a shell dweller. And they're awesome because for the most part, especially the beginner ones, like the multi-shell dweller, Similis, the Brevis, these fish, first of all, small. Again, they're going to max out males, maybe an inch and a half. Not overly aggressive. You definitely want sand in your aquarium. You definitely need shells, as the name implies. I would have at least twice as many shells as you have fish for that aquarium. But then the funnest part, now you've kept shell dwellers before.
Yep.
What happens? You put a half a dozen shell dwellers in a 20 long, and what happens inside of 6 to 9 months?
You don't only have six anymore. They spread out, they reproduce like crazy. And it is one of the coolest things in this hobby because they all have their little homes and they all go to their little shells. And it's not like they could be aggressive if they needed to be, but you're not worried necessarily about there being, little World War III in there. They're not all fighting each other. There's just like a friendly little neighborhood all in their little shells. And it's just absolutely fascinating and adorable. Dare I say the word adorable to watch. I love it.
And I agree with you because, again, if you're keeping those beginner shell dwellers like the ones I've already mentioned, they're going to tolerate one another fairly well in a 20-gallon. People are always alarmed, like, hey, I got these half a dozen shell dwellers, and after 4 to 6 months, I don't have any babies yet. Give them time. First of all, they have to be at a breeding size, which is usually about an inch. Second of all, they have to figure out their environment. And if you like fish, or if you like your aquarium, basically pristine looking and you set it up and you don't want anything to change, shell dwellers are not for you because they're going to stack up sand, they're going to bury shells. But it's nice because if you're someone who's like, I don't really want to do a bunch of aquascaping, sand, shells, some rocks, and you've got a Lake Tanganyikan biotype sort of aquarium, let them bury their shells. And it's awesome because they start making these little homes. You start to see pairs. And one of the most rewarding things about keeping these shell dwellers is when you see the little minuscule babies. And at first they're very shy. So they barely will peek their heads out of the shells. And then as they get older, they get more and more confident. And pretty soon they go an inch away from the shell until mom just rushes them back in. And then pretty soon they're trying to find their own shell and move out on their own. And they're absolutely beautiful. And with the shell dwellers, there's so many different types. So I mentioned three. Now those are mostly silver-ish type fish. The Similis and the Maltese, they have bars, vertical bars that are pretty interesting. But what attracts people to shell dwellers is their personality because you're getting the breeding behavior. The community dynamics in those fish is next level awesome. The way that they protect their own space, protect their shells, communicate aggression towards one another. It's very interesting and it's much more dynamic than what you would see in your typical community fish.
One of the questions that I've seen repeated many times when it comes to shell dwellers, I'm hoping you can answer this because I don't have an answer for it. Where do you get those big old shells for these fish?
That's a great question. And one of the things that we do is we buy escargot shells off of Amazon. And they come in bags of like 24 or 36. They're really inexpensive. Just rinse them off, put them in the water, make sure there's no air bubbles in there. And they sink right away. And they love those shells. They do break down. So those shells will break down in your water over time. And then they're cheap. Doesn't matter. Every time I see the shells kind of breaking down, put new ones in. I leave the old ones in there because that's contributing to the calcium and everything and making that water hard. One of the things that you have to understand, just like we talked about with the Lake Malawis, in fact, especially with Lake Tanganyika, that has out of the three Great Lakes, the hardest water with the highest pH. And so if you're somebody who's got a pH of, you really do want at least upper sevens. Now we're kicking right around a pH of 8, and you could make an argument.
Ideal.
You could go a little higher than that, right? You can go 8, 8.5. And if you've got hard water, we're at 10 degrees on our GH and KH. You can easily go into the upper teens, no problem with those fish. And even at our water parameters, they are very, very happy, live a really long time. So those shells, really they're super cheap. Go on Amazon, type in escargot shells. They come in packs, and it's the easiest setup you'll ever do.
I didn't even realize it was that simple. Now I know. That's good. Escargot shells. I like that. What is that? Escargot is snails. I know that, but what is the particular type of snails? Are they just like apple snails or something, or what do we?
They're big shells. So I don't know. When I go on Amazon, I type in escargot shells. It's the same ones that always pop up. They're kind of beige and brown stripes, and you just chuck them in there. And they're the perfect size for shell dwellers. You can go the expensive route and get the actual Lake Tanganyika specific species of shell, and you'll spend a fortune doing that. But for people, there are people out there who really want a biotope, and everything in that aquarium needs to be Lake Tanganyikan specific. I don't do that. I never have. Those shells are expensive. They're harder to get. So the escargot shells, they're super cheap.
Yeah, and I would imagine if you're getting those that are specific to Lake Tanganyika, that probably means they were pulled from Lake Tanganyika, and we don't want that. Leave it where it is. Come on. That's their home. Don't take their home away from us. So, or don't take their home away from them, not us. Anyway, we move up a level, because we've talked about the teeny ones. And again, the diversity of this lake is amazing because you have those little teeny ones. Maybe I'm missing a level, but I would think the next level would be like, probably mispronouncing this. I've always called them lelupis, the super yellow ones.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Julie's, Gelitochromis, Brichardi, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Brichardi, I absolutely love that fish. I'm a sucker for that lyre tail. I love it. There's not a level between Shelleys and those, is there?
No, I don't think there are. And to finish my thought about the shell dwellers, because there's one important thing I do want to mention. Not all shell dwellers are super, super peaceful and amenable. The gold ocellatus are one that comes to mind, the Meleagris. So be a little careful. Some of the shell dwellers, They can be a little bit harder on one another, a little bit, especially in a 20-gallon, a little bit harder to breed. But Maltese, Similis, Brevis are usually the easiest. But you're absolutely right. When you move up the next level, I have what I call the rock dwellers, right? So that giant group like that you mentioned, Juliochromis, that would be things like Ornatus, the Reagani, Transcriptus. There's a whole bunch of them. Lelupi, which is not a Juliochromis, but it's the same size. And basically, what's really cool about those is one, you can keep them with your shell dwellers. Can you keep them in a 20-gallon? Maybe, but usually by the time we're mixing the Lake Tanganyikans, I really like to have probably like a 40 breeder or like at least a 3-foot tank, just because it gives everybody space to kind of do their own thing. But again, you're looking at a really, really easy setup. Sand, rocks for our rock dwellers. If you've got shell dwellers, because you've got a 40 breeder, you can put shells on one side of the aquarium, let your shell dwellers be where the shells are, your rocks on the other side, let your rock dwellers do what rock dwellers do. And we have had many aquariums, anywhere from 40, well, really 20 longs all the way up to 125-gallon mixed Lake Tanganyikan tanks. And they've been a lot of fun. The cool thing about the rock dwellers is they're a little larger. So typically they're going to max out right around 3 inches or so, maybe 3.5. Males tend to be a little bit longer in some cases. Females tend to be a little bit rounder. The other cool thing, like we talked about with the Mbuna cichlids, is all of these, whether we're talking about shell dwellers or rock dwellers, males and females tend to show the same color, right? So that's kind of cool. Depending on the fish, sometimes the males may have a little bit more flare in their fins, but for the most part, coloration is going to be the same. So that's not really going to be an issue. But the nice thing about the rock dwellers is they have this kind of, most of them have like an elongated shape. So again, we're talking about more than just color. We're talking about visual interest in the shape of the fish. This is also where you really start to see some color popping up. Where the shell dwellers, a lot of them have a variation of kind of silver. Maybe they've got some bars, others have spots. Maybe the exception in the shell dweller land would be like the gold ocellatus, where you have a lot of color. But with the rock dwellers, all of them, just about all of them, either have a really cool pattern or really cool color. And if you're looking for those shell dwellers, you mentioned the Lelupi. That can come in two varieties, either a solid orange or a solid yellow. And I mean, those colors are very vibrant. I don't know if you ever kept the Ornatus. That fish basically looks like the Auratus that we talked about with the Mbuna. It's got yellow and black horizontal stripes, and they look outstanding. Not super aggressive. That's the other thing too. You can keep a group of these in a 20 long, and they, for the most part, get along. I had lots of Juliochromis breeding in 20 longs over the years, and virtually no problems. And once they get started, they can breed a lot too.
Now let me ask you this, and I'd like to know if you cringe at this idea as much as I do. When we had our store, we sold the Lelupi, and we had some Julies too. We had customers. I told them I did not like this idea, but we had customers mix them with Mbunas. You are you okay with this, or like how do you feel about that?
I've done it. I don't think it's a really great idea, because Mbuna tend to be, well, in terms of aggression, they can be a little bit more aggressive than your Lake Tanganyikans. Again, part of that depends on the Lake Tanganyikan. I would put the gold ocellatus or the Meleagris shell dweller up against any Mbuna. There's going to be a problem there, because you look real closely, those shell dwellers, they have fangs. The
Nice.
gold ocellatus, you put your hand in that tank, you will get bit if there are babies in there, and they will draw little tiny droplets of blood. They are fearless. So if you
Oh,
got sponge filters in that tank and you go in there to grab it, or you're trying to move something around and they're protecting babies in a shell, I remember my boys in our 20-gallon gold ocellatus breeding tank. Every once in a while, ow, ooh, ow, ooh. They're trying to move stuff around, or get the filters out there. It's not like, oh my gosh, you just lost a finger, but you feel it. You do feel it. They come at you. The problem is, I think where the bigger issue is they're not super assertive when it comes for time to eat. And so when you're dropping food in the aquarium, the Mbuna go absolutely berserk, like we talked about a few weeks ago in that video, where the Lake Tanganyikans are much more methodical about eating, and they wind up starving. So that's the main reason why I don't necessarily like to keep them together. Most of the time, your shell dwellers and your rock dwellers are going to be really close to structure, and once they find their little home, they're pretty happy. Where the Mbuna, yeah, they like structure too, but they're going to be more open and out in the water. And so by the time the food hits that area where the rock dwellers or the shell dwellers are, it's usually gone. So yeah, I don't like that. Most of the time, I'm keeping my Lake Tanganyikan fish in an aquarium that is a Lake Tanganyikan biotype for the most part.
Well, and I think that's smart, and I think that's the right way to do it. And I would always try to explain to customers, I don't like this. Like, to me, that's the same as putting peacocks with rummy nose tetras. It's
Yeah.
like these are from completely different parts of the world. Yes, they're from the same continent, being that they're both African cichlids, being the like lelupai and mbunas, but that doesn't mean they're the same. These are very different. I don't like it, but I can't not sell you fish. I mean, well, I suppose I could, but
Yeah.
you're in the business of selling fish. You're not going to tell a customer no, but if they want to give it a try. But being someone I've not bred any of these fish, does that help with population control like it would in an Mbuna tank to have some Julies? Or, I mean, I've always known Julies to be aggressive too. Will that help with population control of the Shelleys if you don't want to get overrun if you mixed them?
100%. And so the example that I had for you is I had a 40 breeder where I had some shell dwellers, some brevis shell dwellers, and I had them in a 40 breeder with a fish called Cyprichromis leptosoma. Now, this is an open water fish that is one of the best looking fish from Lake Tanganyika, bar none. I mean, the males, there are different collection points, but the males have a solid blue body and yellow tails. Females are more silvery, and they are just gorgeous fish. But what they would do is they could actually open their mouth fairly large. And I never saw brevis babies in that tank. They ate every shell dweller baby, and they're not aggressive fish, not at all. They're one of the least aggressive Lake Tanganyikan fish you can get. But then what I saw is after a while, after the brevis that were in there grew full size, I stopped seeing Cyprichromis babies, which are actually very large by the time the parents spit them out. So I always tell people, if you are interested in breeding Lake Tanganyikan fish, you basically have to go species only. Because the minute you start mixing even different shell dwellers together or different rock dwellers or rock dwellers with shell dwellers, the likelihood that you're going to see fry is tremendously diminished. And I actually use that to my advantage. And a lot of people do, because for some of the shell dwellers, like the Maltese, the Similis, they start breeding, and it's like a guppies after a while. Like, what am I going to do with all these fish? I have my 50-gallon lowboy, which is a multi shell dweller tank. There are times when I have hundreds upon hundreds of fish. In this market where we're at now, those fish are a dime a dozen. I know some
Wow.
places in the United States, they're still more expensive. So how do I control that? Well, one, if you ever get into that issue, controlling breeding, start removing some of the shells, or when they break down, don't replace them, because those fish can only breed when they have shells to breed in. If the fish are outnumbering the shells, they spend a lot more time protecting their shells. It's not a super aggressive situation, but they tend to breed less, and that's a way to control population. Second way, put in some other type of Lake Tanganyikan fish, and you'll start to see the populations go down pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's nature. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what happens. And
yeah,
if you're trying to get a bunch of these babies, it's pretty counterproductive to put fish in there that are going to eat them. But
yeah.
before I move up to the next level, which I think is the next level, are are we good on the Julies and the Brichardi? And we didn't really talk
Well,
about Brichardi's, but
so the Brichardi is an interesting fish, because to me the next level is more of the open water, small Lake Tanganyikan fish, and the fish that are around rocks, but not necessarily like the true Juliochromis, Lelupai that are like in the rocks, right? So yeah, again, rock dwellers stay small, usually 3 inches, elongated, very interesting, either awesome patterns or awesome color. But if you want to talk about the Brichardi, they're I would yes, they're rock dwellers. So first of all, they're going to breed and usually be around rocks. But to me, that's kind of like a rock dweller that also does spend a decent amount of time in the open water, right? The Brichardi, the daffodils, the pulcher. That would be another one that's basically like a Brichardi, but a little bit more yellow. The Cyprichromis I talked about earlier. These are fish that are going to spend a lot more time in the open water, but still stay relatively small, which is pretty cool. So what you're doing when you add those is you're adding interest in terms of a lot of times color. Cyprichromis, like I just mentioned, gorgeous color. They need some space, so I would highly recommend at least a 4-foot tank, not because of their size, because one, they actually do really well in groups and they love to be in motion. They're midwater swimmers, they're midwater spawners. When they spit their babies out, the babies are very, very visible, like little miniature adults. That's the cutest thing in the world. And they actually start showing color like almost right away. They only have, like the Cyprichromis, the females will only spit out like maybe 3 or 4 babies at a time. So they'll spawn, she'll hold these 3 or 4 babies for a long time, spit them out after about 3 weeks or so, and then they kind of hang around the rocks, especially the little ones, but they're miniatures. They're the cutest thing in the world. The downside, be thoughtful if you ever want to keep Brichardi. They breed like crazy. Probably one of the heaviest breeding fish I've ever had in my fish room, to the point where it's
Wow.
like, I'm breaking this colony up. I'm going to put some of my nicer males. I put them in the 125. You don't even want to know what's going on in that tank in terms of fish. Sold off what I could because they were extraordinarily hard to move, because they make shell dwellers look like, they make guppies look like, dude, what are you doing, man? Your guppies only breed a little bit. Because what the Brichardi do is unlike what a lot of other fish do. The parents have the babies. The babies stay really close to the rocks, but the juveniles from the previous generation, they also protect the babies. So it is a
Oh,
communal protection. It's not just the parents. They are outstanding as a colony. They're outstanding at protecting their fry. So you have to be really careful. If you're going to keep, I always tell people, if you want Brichardi, one, get the daffodils because they're more attractive. And two, you really want to consider having some more smaller predatory fish, which I'm sure we're going to get into here in a minute, because you're going to be overrun. And those fish do not move because everybody's got the same problem with the Brichardi. Once they start breeding, what do you do with 150 of these things?
right. Although I will say, I've said it on this podcast before that I don't think there's too many things on this planet cuter than baby yellow labs. I think they're absolutely adorable. But baby Brichardies, come on now. I mean, that
Yep.
is next level cuteness. What I call it a lyre tail, but that is what it's called,
Basically what
right?
it
The
is.
little,
Yeah.
yeah, little half moon tail. I love that. Absolutely adorable. But then to move up a level above that, I have to tell a bit of a story. It is a depressing story, but the happy ending involves what we're talking about here. I've told the story before about a filter failure that I had. I had a large number of fish in a 150-gallon tank, all African cichlids that I had raised from, babies. Uh, it was horrible. It was horrifying that we lost this tank. We lost probably 60 fish except for one. There was only one fish that survived, and it's a fish that is a Tanganyikan fish that I have had success mixing with Malawis, but a lot of people would tell you not to do it, and that would be a Tropheus.
Mm.
This was a Du Bois eye, which another absolutely adorable small, but then when they get bigger, they look very different than when they're
Mhm.
small. Um, but Tropheus, I mean, am I crazy in saying that's probably the most popular fish sold from Lake Tanganyika? Or, I mean, the most popular fish from Tanganyika is a frontosa, in my opinion. But as far as the volume of fish sold, I feel like maybe Tropheus are the most, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's Shelley's.
I think they used to be at one point. I would say the shell dwellers at this point would vastly outnumber the sales of Tropheus, most likely, if you were to look at nationwide. Only for a couple of reasons. One, you can keep the shell dwellers in a small tank, like we talked about. 20-gallon is pretty much a really solid setup. Tropheus is a different story because
Right.
Tropheus one, there's lots of different types. In fact, I did a Lake Tanganyikan presentation at Aquashella it was a couple of years ago, and I actually showed from Lake Tanganyika where all the different Tropheus come from, and there was a couple dozen on that map, all slightly different colors, very beautiful. Some of them are like the Du Bois eye; they've got the brown and the yellow. Some of them have more of a red color. Some of them are like really, really dark, almost black. So it just depends on the collection point and the different species, of course. But what's interesting about the Tropheus is one, you that is one for me I really, really want to keep in a species only aquarium. And I really, when I've kept them, I don't mix them with other types of even Lake Tanganyikans. One, they can be fairly aggressive, and that's why you probably had success keeping them with the mollies. And I agree with you. I've done that as well. I've had Du Bois in with Mbuna, peacocks, haps. It worked just fine. It was perfectly fine. It that is of all the fish we talk about today, I would say that's the one fish where you really should have some cichlid keeping experience before you dive into the Tropheus aquarium. Because for me personally, if I'm keeping them, I want at least a 75-gallon tank. They're going to be overstocked, and I'm going to have a fairly large group of them, 20, 25 at least. And then you have to be aware that the Tropheus, they can, not always, but they can bloat if their protein gets too high. So tend to like to feed them like North Fin kelp, whether it's the kelp flakes, the kelp wafers, the veggie pellets, something vegetable based. Now, can they be transitioned to a higher protein diet? Yeah, you can do that slowly over time. Would I be feeding them a bunch of bloodworms all the time? No, they will bloat and you'll have a heck of a problem. So you got to be really careful with the Tropheus in particular. But yeah, that's a certainly one you could keep with Mbuna.
I've always talked about Tropheus, and I've always called them the Mbuna of Lake Tanganyika. I mean, they kind of look similar, but then again, they really don't because they have more of that kind of scoop mouth. I guess there's some Mbunas that have a very similar shape to Tropheus. I would actually say there's Mbunas that have the shape of Tropheus, not Tropheus that have the shape of Mbunas, but who cares? I'm going off on a tangent here, but that's what I've always said is whatever you're going to do, treat it like Mbunas, but give them a little more open space than you would Mbunas. Like you can fill a tank with rocks for Mbunas and they would just think it's the best thing in the world. You're going to want to have a little bit more open space for those Tropheus. But I believe that the Tropheus du Bois has probably frustrated more people than any other fish in this hobby because of the drastic change that fish goes through. And it's so sad because it reminds me like a baby. I've always called them polennies. I don't know what you call them. Or polleni. I don't know how you pronounce it. Big black fish with white polka dots. The Du Bois, this teeny fish with black fish with bright white polka dots. Oh, but they change drastically to a bluish, brownish. I don't even know how to describe their adult form. Still a really nice fish. It's almost like a rainbow fish, Bosemani rainbow of Lake Tanganyika, like very defined transition from blue to black or whatever the colors are. I think they're fascinating, but I think there's a lot of people that have bought Du Bois thinking it's going to be this beautiful black fish with white polka dots forever, and then they're disappointed when they grow up.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And that's one of those ones where you can't find them at a Petco or a PetSmart. And yeah, you buy them black, white polka dots, awesome. And then it's more of to me, they have like a brown, it turns into a brown fish with like a yellow patch. And like you said, they're still pretty fish, but they're not as dynamic. They don't look as nice, I think, as when they're little tiny guys. But yeah, it's an interesting group for sure. And it's, to be honest, of the Lake Tanganyikans, it's probably the one I'm least likely to keep just because I don't want to dedicate an entire aquarium to that one fish and not have some diversity in there because it's a little bit more challenging.
I understand that, but I am the guy with a tank full of nothing but yellow labs, and I absolutely love it. It's my favorite tank in the world. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's really a move up in size, but all of the altos I feel like would be next. And this is where things get a little murky for me. Like we go from Tropheus straight up to Frontosas. And I guess the only thing in between is that the Compressiceps and things like that. The Goldhead Compressicep is the alien of Lake Tanganyika. I talked about it earlier. What a weird looking fish, but that's what makes me love them. That scoop to their head, and it's just the most unique looking thing. I got one, which I only had him temporarily because I'm a big dummy, but I got a wild caught one from a place that I will not name, and the guy was like, it's no big deal. You can put it right in with your Tanganyikan fish. And it went in there for a while, but I said Tanganyikan. I meant Malawian fish.
Hmm.
Same tank that Tropheus was in, just a completely mixed tank. Peacocks, haps, and bunas. There were frontosas in there. There was kind of a little bit of everything. Put it in that tank, and it didn't last maybe 2 months. I got out of that fish. But we're also talking about over 10 years ago, so might have been 2 years.
You're absolutely right. They're awesome fish. So Compressiceps and Calvus would be what I would call
Calvus, yep.
the smaller predatory Lake Tanganyikan fish. And when I say predatory, a lot of people think, oh, aggressive. No, they're not. In fact, they're some of the least aggressive, in my opinion, least aggressive Lake Tanganyikan fish you can buy. They look absolutely menacing because, like you said, they got that slope to their head, and their lower jaw kind of sticks out. And they are designed to be stuck in between rocks because they are very flat fish, right? So they're very, very skinny, flat fish, but they're tall bodied. And the reason they have that body shape is they're designed to just be in between rocks, and they wait, and they're very patient. And then as fish swim by, boom, they grab them. So if you're going to keep the Calvus and the Compressiceps, know that your fry, there's not going to be any fry survival there. They're expert hunters. They will hunt down any fry that's produced. It doesn't matter how good, if you got ocellatus in there or Meleagris or some really good parent, it's irrelevant. Those fish will eventually get them. So the interesting thing about both the Compressiceps and the Calvus is it takes forever for them to grow to full size. Calvus stays smaller than Compressiceps. The Calvus, you're lucky if you get around 3 inches max, 2.5 to 3 inches. Compressiceps, larger, 3.5, 4 inches, sometimes a little bit larger, depending on the species. But it takes years and years to get them that size. And so the joke is always, hey, how large is your Compressiceps? Oh, it's 2 inches. What have you had it? 15 years? Because there's some of the slowest growing fish that I've ever seen in my life. I had full-grown inkfin Calvus in my 75-gallon. People are like, I've never seen them that large. I'm like, yeah, I've had them for 6-7 years, and they were well fed. The other thing that's interesting about those fish is their scales are actually like razor sharp. So what winds up happening is if something attacks them and they bite on the side of their body, they'll cut up their mouth. So
Wow.
It's a really good defense mechanism for those fish. So they will absolutely get shredded if something tries to bite a Calvus or a Compressiceps. So they're very interesting, really cool looking. If you're going to see aggression with those fish, sometimes the males might be a little aggressive towards one another. So I really love to have, now the Calvus, you can keep them in a 20 long, tons and tons of rocks, especially if you've got multiple males. But you get a 40 breeder or larger and you've got a lot of rock work in there, you can absolutely keep multiple males together. They will find their own space. Females, for the most part, get along just fine. All these fish we're talking about, the rock dwellers, the Brichardi, the Calvus, the Compressiceps, they breed in rocks and you will never see them breeding. So it's not like the Malawi fish, the Mbuna, the peacocks, where they're doing the little dance at the bottom and picking up eggs and doing all that stuff. You'll see that almost all the time. But with these guys, they're very secretive. I've had thousands of babies of rock dwellers and all this stuff. And not once have I ever seen them like, oh, they're breeding. Okay, here we go. Normally you just start seeing a bunch of fry peeking off from the rocks. I'm like, oh, well, somebody bred in there. So yeah, they're very secretive when it comes to breeding.
Well, and in my experience, correct me if I'm wrong, with the Calvus and the Compressiceps, this is probably the least active fish I've seen in the African cichlid world. I mean, it is not uncommon because I've kept Calvus and Compressiceps in tanks other than that one that I had mixed. And it was not uncommon to see them sit in one spot all day. Yeah. And just sit there. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just sitting there looking cool with that mouth. Not a whole lot of action to them, but they look so daggone cool. It's worth it to, but you're not going to have them coming up to the glass at feeding time. And they're just not going to do that. They just sit there, and it's almost like a pleco. Like we're sitting here recording for the next 4 hours. That pleco right there is probably not going to move the entire time. And, Calvus and Compressiceps do the same thing, but fascinating fish. But I think, again, not my holy grail fish. I'll get to that. But the Frontosa is next.
But is it?
Well, see, that was my question. Like, am I missing something? I feel like I'm missing some of these mid-range fish.
are some fish from Lake Tanganyika that are almost always, and in fact, when I did my presentation, I skipped them completely because I didn't have time, and we'll only mention them here for about 3 seconds, and then we'll move on to your next fish. All of the what I like to call the goby like Lake Tanganyikan fish. So, like an
Yeah.
example might be the Tiger pictilis. These are fish that are elongated that spend almost all their time near the bottom. Some of them have colors like you couldn't even imagine, and many of them are extremely expensive. So I've had a number of these fish. Like Tiger pictilis is probably the one that I've had the most experience with. But if you're looking for extremely unusual body shape, again, goby like in their behaviors, the Lake Tanganyikan, some of those Lake Tanganyikan goby like cichlids are really, really cool. And the other one is big money. You will
Is this
not
going to make
spend,
me do hand to forehead?
yes, you are not going, and I've got them, I've got both of them in here right now in my fish room in quarantine because they're going to our swaps here in the next month or so. What I like to call all your featherfin Tanganyikans. So these are all your ophthalmotilapia, like your ventralis. Google ophthalmotilapia ventralis, or just Google ventralis cichlid. These fish, the males, have some of the most extraordinary color you're ever going to see. Now, some of them range anywhere from around 3.5 to 4 inches. Some of them, like we've got these fish called the Furcifer rosebas, they will max out at around 7 or 8 inches. They're all open water swimmers, and the colors will blow you away. They will
Hmm.
absolutely, you will not believe the colors that you see on these Lake Tanganyikan fish. And so the downside is with the Furcifer rosebas and the ventralis, the Parasiprochromis would be another one. When you go to the pet store and people actually have these things, if they're colored up at all, easily 75 to 100 bucks a piece for the males, easily. And this
Wow.
is one where the females actually cost a decent amount too, because even though they're more silvery, they're a really pretty silver, and the finnage on these fish, long trailers and really long dorsal fins, and then also pectoral fins can be really long. So insane fish. But if you just type in Lake Tanganyikan featherfin cichlids, you will be blown away. These fish are phenomenal, but extremely expensive, and I highly recommend give some space. Ventralis, you got a 40 breeder, you're fine. But like something like the Furcifer roseba, 75-gallon, 6-foot tank, they are glorious. They're absolutely glorious fish. So
See, you're teaching. I told you when we were first starting, you're going to teach me something here. That was one I hadn't even thought of. And that's why I'm glad to have an expert. Yes, you
uh,
are on Lake Tanganyika on here with me because for me, it's Shelley's Tropheus frontosus. That like,
yeah. And we're leaving
I,
out a bunch. I mean, don't get me wrong. We're not. This is not an all inclusive. There are, in I don't know how many times I've ordered these things, and they always come in the wrong way. But there are Lake Tanganyikan fish out there that are extremely rare. Another one that escapes my mind. What was the? Oh darn! It'll come back to me. But there's a when the super rare one comes to my mind. I'm getting old.
well, it's the largest lake in Africa.
It came to my mind. The
Okay, there you
Lake
go.
Tanganyikan killifish. So there is actually a Lake Tanganyikan killifish out there. They don't live a super long time, but they're a smaller fish. It almost looks like a community type of, like it would fit in a community situation. But if you're looking for a small schooling, open water type of fish to go with maybe rock dwellers and like a 40 breeder, those Lake Tanganyikan killifish are really cool too.
See, there you go again. I would have never that would have never come to mind for me, which is why I like working with an expert rather than doing this on my own.
Just a nerd, a Lake Tanganyikan nerd is what I am.
Well, you've kept a lot of them, and I'm going to call you an expert, and I'll say it to your face. I'm not going to argue about it. Certainly more of an expert than me, but I believe you have, you have your small fish people, and then you have people like me that are the big fish people. And if you fall into the category of big fish people, and you think like Lake Tanganyika, you automatically go to Frontosis. I mean, that's just what it is. In fact, I would dare to say that the maybe the majority, or maybe it's 50-50 of the people that clicked on this when they saw Lake Tanganyika in the title, they did it because they wanted to hear about Frontosis. I mean, it is one of the most bold, striking fish that you're ever going to find in this hobby. Very boring, but the way they look They cannot be denied. One of my absolute favorites. There's several different types of them. I'm kind of partial to the Mpembwe blues myself, but there's several different types. But this is when we're definitely getting into the, like, when we're talking about tank setup and all that, we're talking more like the hap category here, where lots of open space, much larger fish. They can get over a foot. Some of them, they're going to take an eternity, like the Calvis, to get there. They're not in a hurry to do anything, but when they get there, I mean, listen, are there many things prettier than a tank full of frontosas? Come on. Tell me there's a cooler tank than that.
I don't know. I did a species profile on, I didn't use my own tank. It came from Ohio Fish Rescue, and he had I don't even know what that tank was. It was close to 1,000 gallons, maybe. I don't remember exactly. It was 8, 9, 10 feet long. And then I don't know how many, 3 feet, 4 feet wide, and another couple, probably 3 feet, maybe 4 feet tall. And there was a massive group of basically full grown frontosa in that aquarium. And like you said, you're talking many years to get those fish to that size. The big mistake that people make is they think, okay, this is a big fish, therefore it's going to be the king of the tank. And that is one where absolutely not. Do not put those fish with any Lake Malawi fish, not the Mbuna, not the peacocks, not the haps. They will get bullied. They will get outcompeted for food, and they will not protect themselves. And then they just sulk. They go into a corner, they hide, then they don't eat, and then they die. So when it comes to the frontosa, like you mentioned, they really do need to be almost in a species only tank and in a big tank. If I were keeping a group of frontosa, it would be like a tank that you have behind you. What is that? Is that the
360? 360. Yeah.
That's where they belong. They belong in a tank like that, because you're looking at a fish that gets at least a foot long, and they get tall and they get wide bodied, and they've got a pretty decent sized bioload. They're not all that dissimilar in terms of their bioload from Oscars. They're not as messy. They don't cause as much of a mess. They don't move as much, but in terms of their food, they eat a lot. And then it becomes really tricky when you have a full grown frontosa. They have big mouths, and whatever can fit in their mouth, they will eat. What do you keep with them? There's not much out there. Full grown Synodontis cats are perfectly fine. Your large feather fins, like the Furcifer rosebas that I mentioned, are probably going to work out okay. If you want to try, if you got a really large tank with tons and tons of rocks, you're like, all right, I'm going to throw some rock dwellers in there because I think that they'll just stick by the rocks and the frontosa won't mess with them. That can work sometimes, but to me, it's a species only tank, and a fish that if you're getting them at a decent size, they're very expensive. Even at a couple inches, 2 or 3 inches, it's not uncommon to pay 20, 30, $40 a piece for them, especially like the Black Widow frontosa, still commanding $40 to $50 each on the retail side. So expensive, get large, grow extremely slow, big tank. You're very limited on tank mates with those fish, in my opinion.
I'm not going to sit here and argue with you. I think that perfect world, you're absolutely right. Put them in a tank by themselves, and they're so striking. You don't need anything else in there. You're going to make your bold statement with the frontosas. However, I have kept them successfully with other Malawi fish. Am I going to tell you the situation was ideal? Well, it was ideal as I could make it. It was a 240, 8 foot 240. So it was 8 by 2 by 2. And I didn't have any problems with them or with the other fish beating on them. These were all fish that were older, and they were not as spunky. It was all males, so there wasn't, breeding aggression happening. So they got along with everybody, and everybody got along with them, and it was fine. But I agree, ideal scenario, put them in a tank by themselves. I did have, for a while, a tank with nothing but a large group of Mpembwe blue frontosas in there, and it was one of my favorite tanks ever. Did a couple of videos about that, and one of the most exciting things I've seen happen after I had that group for like 2.5 years, and they were 4 or 5 inches when I got them. I had them for a couple of years. I had one with a mouthful of eggs. Wow. And nothing happened. I know, they are mouth brooders, but I think they hold the eggs a lot longer than Malawis. I don't know a whole lot about breeding frontosas, but I had one with a mouthful of eggs, but then like 2 days later, they were all gone. I was like, that was as far as I ever got with breeding them. But absolutely fascinating fish. It's again, it's all about size. You want to have the best impact, the most jaw-dropping tank. Get that 240. Put you a group of them in there. You know, if you want to make the biggest statement the fastest, buy them bigger and pay big money for them. I have a piece of B-roll that I've used like 25 times in my videos on the KG Tropicals channel of one of the nicest frontosas I've ever seen. It was about maybe 8 inches long at a pet store for sale, $300.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Wouldn't surprise me at all.
worth every penny of that $300. I mean, just absolutely unbelievable. So good that I've used it multiple times. And it also had like a blue background, and like they had it set up perfectly to just really showcase that fish. It was very well done. If I can think about it, I'll put that B-roll on top of us right now as we're speaking. One of the prettiest frontosas I've ever seen. But now I need to, unless you have any others that are big like frontosas, don't steal my Holy Grail one from me. But there is a large cichlid that has been on my Holy Grail list, and I had always thought they were almost like the Asian arowana. Not that they're illegal, but I had always thought this is just never going to be a fish that I would ever see. Like I'd ever even have the option of ever buying. But I've said it many times, if I ever see one of these for sale, I'm buying one. That is what I've been told is the largest cichlid in the world, not just of the African cichlid world. I'm talking about the emperor cichlid from Lake Tanganyika. Are you familiar with this fish at all? Or
I've seen it once.
Okay.
So I was at a fish the same time when we were talking with the Lake Malawis in part 2, and you had mentioned the Malawi trout.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I
Chapsicromus?
same location where I saw that fish in the basement of this fish room. They had a massive, I thought it was a cylinder tank, but I don't remember. It was just a massive tank in this basement of this fish room, in this fish store. And they had one of those fish, and it was massive. I think it might have been, well, 18, 20 inches at that time. And they can get bigger.
Let me ask you this question. Would that happen to have been in New Jersey?
No, it was outside of Cleveland. It was outside of Strongsville or Cleveland, because I remember doing a fish store like hop on the Friday of the extravaganza, the Ohio Cichlid Association extravaganza. And we went to one store, and then he had it downstairs, and he let us down there, and that fish was down there.
Maybe it is. Maybe I'm wrong when I say New Jersey. David Hale is the guy's name. It's the only person I've ever known to have one.
Okay.
And he owns a fish store. I believe the fish store is called Something Fishy. And the emperor was in the basement of his fish store. So it sounds like we're talking about the same fish.
And now I'm Googling it, because now Something Fishy, I've been to
I've never been
store.
to this store. The only reason I know this is because of our mutual friend, the other Jason Wilson. He told me about it. We actually, Jay Wilson and I did a video together way back. It was in like 2018 or 2019. And he was talking about this, and he was talking about that fish.
I think we're talking about the same place, because I'm looking it up right now as we're speaking. Something Fishy came up, Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay.
That had to have been where I saw that fish.
Then I was wrong when I said New Jersey. That was my bad. I don't know. I don't know what made me think New Jersey. Jay goes everywhere. So
that was very cool. Yep.
Yeah.
Something Fishy in Cleveland. I have if you guys want to see it, I have a fish store tour. And I don't remember. I'm pretty sure that fish is on that video. But if you typed in Something Fishy, probably Primetime Aquatics, it would probably come up. Certainly the Malawi trout would be there, because that took up the entire last half of the video, or not half, but little part of the video. But I'm pretty sure I got that fish on camera.
Well, you know that this is a rare fish when you have two people on a podcast at the same time that live on opposite sides of the country. Well, you're really in the middle and I'm on the edge, but live very far apart from each other. And we both talk about the only person we've ever met who happens to be in Cleveland. Yeah, I said it was wrong. They have this fish. That's the only one I've ever heard of anybody owning in the hobby. Not saying there aren't others. There probably is. I haven't. It's not like I've spent my life searching for one, but this is it's an emperor. It's called the emperor for a reason. I mean, this is just a rock star of a fish. I can't tell you a whole lot about him because I've never had the option to get one, so I don't know the specifics, but I know, according to Jay Wilson, it is the largest cichlid in existence. But
I'm just looking it up now because I don't know much about it myself.
The thing is with this fish, it's not
max
the
size.
most
So
attractive.
max size is 3 feet. So yeah, that would easily. You're basically looking at what, maybe a peacock bass that would be challenging it, in terms of overall size.
And maybe the Dovai, maybe. I mean, there are some titans.
Yeah.
There's some titans, but and all three of those would be, but whether it's the largest cichlid or not, it has to be said that the peacock bass is a very striking fish. Bright yellow. I mean, it's you see that fish from a mile away. The emperor, not so much. I think what makes me want this fish is just the fact that I don't know anybody that has one. Yeah. I think that's, that elusiveness of it. Like, it's rare. If you have one, you're going to be one of the guys that has one, and very few people do. I think that's what makes it appealing to me. It's not the most attractive fish. No. I'd say it's probably as attractive as a Dovai. Dovai aren't gorgeous fish.
No, it's kind of like a silvery, from what I could remember, it was like a silverish, brownish, tannish sort of fish. Yeah. Nothing spectacular other than the fact that it was really big. And
it's a great looking fish, but it just looks like a fish. It doesn't look like some ornamental, gorgeous, like a peacock bass does. I mean, or datinoids or something like that are really striking. The emperor falls in the category of just kind of a bland. It's cool.
What
the
it
thing
reminds
that makes
me
it
of?
cool is it's big.
It reminds you of a tilapia. Like, my tilapia, I thought was gorgeous colors, but a lot of the tilapias are just bland. My guess is, if you were to ask people that live around Lake Tanganyika, that's a food fish. That is a great food fish when they catch those. The likelihood of them exporting it as a pet, well, one, who's going to be able to house a 3 foot? It's probably why we never see it, because it's a plain looking fish that looks similar to like a bass would, only not green in our area, that most people can't house. And it's not like you're going to, oh my gosh, look at colors.
But you know what? I went to a fish store in Greenbelt, Maryland. It was called Greenbelt Aquariums, I think, in Maryland. I swear to you, they had like 33,000 Dovai because they had a breeding pair in there, and they had a whole row of tanks going all the way around the store that was just full of Dovai fry. That's a fish that gets almost as big as the emperor. Yeah. People like big fish. There's crazy people out there. Sure. That same store had 30 Arapaimas for sale for $150 each too. But again, you're probably right. That's a long way to transport a big giant fish like that from Africa all the way to here. I don't know where to get one. I don't know if they're for sale. I wouldn't imagine anybody here is breeding them, because I don't think they're a super sought after fish, but that's one of those that I've wanted ever since I got into African cichlids. I've always thought I want that, and the only reason I want it is because nobody I know has it. Yeah. But that is my holy grail African cichlid from Lake Tanganyika. My holy grail African cichlid is the fully mature male trout, which I hope to someday have. I think the likelihood of me getting that is far greater than getting an emperor, but I also just think the name emperor is really cool, and I'm a simple person. So
give it a great name and I'm in.
That's right. I mean, it reminds me of Star Wars. You think it too. The first second you hear emperor, you think of Star Wars. So
it's true.
I actually, very rudely, while you were talking earlier, I looked it up because I wanted to find out the scientific name for this fish.
Oh, I looked that up too. Microleptis is fine. B. microleptis, I think, is what it was called.
Yeah, but the B stands for
Burlecken. I looked at it, I was like, I don't feel like trying to pronounce that.
Bollingerachromis. Bollingerachromis? That's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to go with that.
Was it Microleptis?
Yes, Microlepis. No T.
Microlepis, okay.
And that's easy. You can get that real simple, but the first part, But the common name would be emperor cichlid or giant cichlid. I wonder why. I'm fascinated by that one, and I don't have one, but I could see myself setting up a big old tank just for that one like this. I don't know why, but that just appeals to me. I would,
Sure.
it would be the only fish in the tank because, like Dovi, they're not going to tolerate even a cricket being in there with them. So I don't know why I said cricket. That was really dumb. Sorry about that. But no, not many fish are going to allow a cricket to be in their tank for very long. I'm an idiot. Why you chose to be my partner in podcasting, I have no idea. But
it was a series of bad decisions in my life, but we've made it work.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you did because
we make the best of a situation.
Well, you got the smart guy and the dummy, and we complement each other, and it works out good. But speaking of your expertise, I want to turn it over to you. We're hitting that hour mark. I've exhausted all of my Lake Tanganyika knowledge. Did we leave out anything that you think we need to talk about?
Oh, undoubtedly we did, but we hit the important points, right? We talked about shell dwellers, rock dwellers. We talked about those fish that are kind of open water. We talked about the predatories, the calvus, the compressiceps. We covered the frontosa. We covered the feather fins. We even mentioned the Lake Tanganyika goby-like fish. So I think that would give most people a pretty solid, if you're listening to this, you've got a pretty solid background on the Lake Tanganyikans. But the bottom line is, especially if you've got harder water, especially if you have a higher pH, give them a try. If you've got a 20-gallon, go with some shell dwellers or some rock dwellers. You've got something bigger and you want to do a Lake Tanganyikan community tank, it can be a lot of fun. And you're going to have a lot of interest with all different shapes of the fish and the colors and everything, the personalities. It's awesome.
We mentioned the word diversity in the beginning, and that is absolutely true. It's almost the diversity level of an Amazon river. I mean, there's so many different fish that come from that lake. Largest lake in Africa, not in the world, or is it in the world? I don't know.
It's certainly the deepest. I wouldn't say it's the largest, Lake Tanganyika, but it is the deepest. When I did my Lake Tanganyikan presentation, I showed the lake itself, and I showed its depth, its surface area, its volume. And so it's up there, though. It's a very large lake.
But it is the largest in the continent of Africa, though, right?
By volume, I believe it is.
Yeah, I thought I heard that.
Just because it's so incredibly deep. But it's a very long, skinny lake. So not by surface area, but by volume. Yeah, it's because it's so deep.
It's certainly the largest of the big three that we know that the fish come from that we love in this hobby. But, who cares about all of that? This has been a lot of fun. We could, if I'm being honest with you, we could just do a podcast where every episode is about African cichlids, and I'd be delighted. I'd have so much fun because there's just so much to talk about. There's no way we can hit it all, even in 3 videos. I don't know what we would talk about if we were going to do another episode of African cichlids, but don't hesitate, viewers, listeners, putting it down in the comments. There's even comments available now on Spotify. If you have a suggestion for an African cichlid topic, put it down in there. Let us know what you think, what you'd like to hear. And I'll ask questions that I don't know the answer to the expert Jason, who can answer those questions. It'll be a lot of fun.
Well, and the other question too is, do we start to venture off into the South and Central American cichlids? Because that's a whole separate topic, right? And lots to talk about there as well. I mean, that one we could just organize by size. Little tiny guys, medium-sized guys, big jumbo bruiser guys, So if you want to hear about that, let us know.
Cichlid is a very broad type of fish. There's tons from all over the world. It could be a cichlid podcast and just never talk about anything else. But on the topic of talking about anything else, we got more episodes to record today. Very exciting episodes coming up. So with all of that, I hope we were able to, I hope Jason was able to educate you a little bit on Lake Tanganyika. We have certainly enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. We can't wait to see you on the next episode.
Y'all have a great week, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.